Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this exciting and historic event, the opening ceremony of Learning from Our History, an exhibit of dockets for enslaved people in Delaware County. This is a collaboration between the college and the Delaware County Bar Association. Approximately 15 years ago, the Delaware County Bar Association became the keeper of certain historical records informally known as the slave dockets. This book is the original docketing or official transcript of criminal and other legal matters relative to persons of African ancestry living in what was then Chester County, Pennsylvania. The first entry dates back to 1762. Tonight's event marks the start of the one-year residency of the dockets at the college, which, following this presentation, will be on display at the Delaware County Community College Marple Campus Learning Commons. I do want to let our audience know that the nature of the topics we will discuss tonight is incredibly difficult and may be distressing, especially to younger viewers. This, of course, is necessary when exploring the history of slavery in our country, but this program may leave you with a lot to process. All attendees will be receiving a follow-up email with resources that can help you go beyond this conversation. Additionally, you also will receive information in the future on any new projects we will be doing with the dockets. We hope that this helps, and we thank you all for choosing to learn from our history tonight. Before we get started, we will hear a few welcoming words, starting with the president of Delaware County Community College, Dr. Joy Gates Black.
Good evening. I would like to welcome everyone, including our distinguished guests, Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon, representatives from Senator Casey's office, Governor Wolf's office, and our state and local legislators. It is my pleasure to also welcome members of the Delaware County Bar Association, the Board of Trustees, faculty, staff, and students of Delaware County Community College, and our community members and business leaders. The slave dockets, as these documents are commonly referred to, they are extremely fragile, and thus they need to be closely and carefully protected. For me, the fragility of these documents is a mirror of the fragility of freedom and true democracy, something which must also be closely and carefully protected. As president of this college, these dockets serve as an educational opportunity for all of us to be better informed about our past. As an African American woman, these dockets serve as a painful reminder of a time when people of color were considered as property, to be bought and sold and treated as less than human. Though our nation is not the same as when ink first touched paper in these dockets, there is still work to be done so that equity and fairness exists for all. Tonight, as we learn more about these dockets and engage in honest dialogue about their historical and emotional significance, let us remember President Abraham Lincoln's closing to the Gettysburg Address, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. May the lessons of our past ensure that all of us, of every color and identity, strive for a future in which we all benefit from a new birth of freedom. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Carrie Wood, Esquire, President of the Delaware County Bar Association.
My name is Carrie Woody, and I have the privilege of serving as the 2022 president of the Delaware County Bar Association. It's the association's mission to serve our members and the community at large by fostering respect for the law, by advancing the competent, collegial, and ethical practice of the legal profession, and creating opportunities for attorneys, judges, and the public to work collaboratively for justice. 2022 is a very special year for our 1,200 members as we celebrate the 150th anniversary of our association. Myself, Robert Kelly Esquire, Colleen Neary Esquire, we're the co-chairs of our association's 150th anniversary committee, and we're the co-host of this event. Our committee will present programs all year long to celebrate our 150 years of history, starting with this special event. This event begins our one-year loan of these historical dockets to the college. Our association values not just preserving, but studying history, and we are excited to collaborate with the college as we delve into, and most importantly, learn from, our county's past. Please look out for more events at our association that celebrate our history, and more events at the college that explore these historical dockets. Enjoy tonight's presentation, featuring a very special member of our association, retired Judge Nathaniel C. Nichols.
And finally, we are honored to hear a few words from Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon, joining us on Zoom.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you tonight to mark the opening of the Learning from Our History exhibit. I'm so grateful to Delaware County Community College and the Delaware County Bar Association for making this important part of our region's history available to the public. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this ceremony. You know, as a student of law and history, I'm keenly aware of how history helps us to understand current issues and complex problems, and to see how the past has shaped communities, relationships, and events. And at this moment in time, it's particularly important that we come together for education and reflection on the uniquely American history of slavery, the horrors it entailed, and which America has historically failed to fully address. Yet to this very day, we live with the long-term effects and consequences of slavery in America. It continues to shape our economic, cultural, and social structures. To move forward with the work of dismantling institutional racism, it's essential that we start by looking critically at how we got here. That shameful but central part of our history cannot and should not be sugar-coated or minimized just because it makes some people uncomfortable or requires difficult discussions or reassessment of preconceptions. We ignore the truth at our peril. The slave dockets that we're here to see tonight are an important and an extraordinary primary source. They're a piece of history that carries the weight of hundreds and hundreds of stories. It's the original official transcript of criminal and other legal matters related to individuals of African ancestry living in what was then part of Chester County and is now Delaware County. I've always found that primary sources, such as the slave dockets we see tonight, have the power to bring history to life, experiencing that tangible history, although we will be careful because we know they're fragile, but experiencing it and understanding that there were actual people who were the subject of the dockets, who entered information upon the pages. It emphasizes just how real, recent, and relevant our past is. This particular docket includes a summary of trials involving both enslaved and free Black people, registrations of then enslaved Pennsylvanians, and several slave manumissions, registrations that were vital for a formerly enslaved person to prove they'd been granted their freedom. We're lucky to have such a resource available for public view here in Delco. Delaware County Community College students, faculty, and staff, as well as community groups and residents, will now have an opportunity to learn more about the significant impact that slavery had on our region. I look forward to learning more myself this evening from Judge Nichols and Dr. Williams. Thank you again for allowing me to be here.
And thank you again, Congresswoman Scanlon, for those wonderful words to get us started. So I briefly want to say to the audience who is joining us today that you can interact with our session through our Q&A button on Zoom. And so if you are connected via Zoom, at the bottom of the panel that you're connected with, you should see a Q&A button. If you don't see it, you may have to move your mic around, your mouse around just to wake Zoom up. But please feel free to put questions in. We will try to take questions throughout the session if they coordinate with what we are talking about, and then we also will try to save time at the end for additional questions. All right, so now it is my honor to introduce our wonderful panel for this evening. starting with Nathaniel C. Nichols. Judge Nichols graduated from Howard University in 1970 and Columbia University School of Law in 1973. His legal career began in 1974 at Delaware County Legal Assistance Association, where he became the managing attorney. He later went into private practice with the firm of Early, Nichols, and Gibbons, and eventually went on to become a partner in the firm of Nichols and Gibbons. In 1986, he joined the faculty of Widener University School of Law as a clinical professor and became the first African-American tenured law professor at Widener. As a clinical professor, he supervised law students who represented low-income clients before the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas and the United States Bankruptcy Court. His career at Widener also included positions as Dean of Students and the Director of Clinical Programs. Over his 25-year academic career, he wrote several law review articles and taught creditors' rights, consumer bankruptcy, domestic violence law, and property. In 2011, he was elected as judge on the Court of Common Pleas of Delaware County, where he heard dependency cases and juvenile cases. He retired from that position in January of 2019, and he is a member of the American, Pennsylvania, and Delaware County Bar Associations. Judge Nichols served on the Lincoln University Board of Trustees from 2014 to 2018. Over his 45-year legal career, he has been the recipient of numerous awards. Most recently, he received the 2018 Child Advocate of the Year Award from the Children's Rights Committee of the PA Bar Association, and in November of 2019 was recognized by the Juvenile Court Judges Commission for his service on the commission. He retired from the Court of Common Pleas in 2019. And then next, Dr. Ife Williams is a professor of political science at Delaware County Community College in Media, Pennsylvania, a graduate of Lincoln University, master's degree in American government, and doctorate in political science from Clark Atlanta University. Her manuscript, Police Brutality, The Philadelphia Story, is currently under review by Lexington Press. Ife Williams has recently embarked on broadening the scope of the classroom and has completed an interactive Google map on enslaved African revolts. She is a 3-time Fulbright Award recipient and has engaged in social justice activities and research around global reparations. Dr. Williams is past president of the African Heritage Studies Association, founded by John Henrik Clarke to promote scholarship on Africa and the African diaspora. And thank you both so much for being here with me tonight. At this time, I will join both of our panelists for a libation ceremony explained and performed by Dr. Ife Williams.
Good evening, everyone. One of the ceremonies practiced by Africans and African descendants throughout the diaspora is the pouring of libations. The purpose is to invoke the spirit of our ancestors, as there is no distinction between the secular and the sacred in our communities. In fact, during enslavement, many Africans gathered and had their activities on burial grounds. So it is at this time, as we tell the stories of our ancestors in the dockets, it is most appropriate and right and respectful to honor them and ask their permission to move ahead. It is our hope, by raising their stories, that we can bring honor, dignity, justice, and fairness to what happened to them in these dockets, and also that they may stand as remembrance of the thousands of Africans who were enslaved here in Pennsylvania. As I call the names of our ancestors, I would ask that you reply with Ashe. Say Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
It means so it is. First, I want to call on the spirit of Sam.
Ashe.
Cambridge,
Ashe.
Abraham,
Ashe.
Martin,
Ashe.
Philip,
Ashe.
Primus,
Ashe.
Phoebe.
Ashe.
Phoebe is the only female in the docket who was executed for stealing a few items. She was hung by the neck until death. Dick,
Ashe.
Lassie,
Ashe.
Mary,
Ashe.
thank you, ancestors, for giving us this opportunity to lift your words, and hopefully your words will trickle down to today and inspire us to further move towards justice. Okay.
And again, I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Williams. We wanted to note that this plant, which has been generously donated by the Bar Association, commonly known as a snake plant, grows throughout the tropical regions of Africa. For this ceremony, we wanted to use a plant native to the African continent to honor those whose names were mentioned. All right, so now let's get into the discussion. So firstly, thank you all again so much for being here to have this conversation with me. As we jump into the conversation, we're going to be critically unpacking the realities of slavery. And I wanted to start with a quote that I believe shows the extent to which Black people were not seen or treated as humans, but as property. A 1669 Virginia colony law deemed that killing one's slave could not amount to murder because the law would assume no malice or intent to destroy his own estate. And this is a quote by Heather McGhee from her book, The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. So to get us started, I think we need to set the historical stage, because when we think about slavery in the US, we often just think about the South. And that really limits our understanding of the impact of slavery everywhere in the US. In the book Slavery in the North: Forgetting History and Recovering Memory, Mark Howard Ross specifically talks about Northern slavery fading from collective consciousness and moments of recollection where people are shocked that certain people or sites were also connected with slave ownership. So starting with you, Dr. Williams, can you talk to us about the landscape of slavery in the North, the wider area surrounding our county, and maybe speak a bit to why we may often forget just how prevalent slavery was?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And it is a lot. It's a lot, but I'm going to try to be as succinct as possible. Yes, it is a myth that slavery predominantly took place in the South, and that the North was somehow absolved from that institution, okay? The best term I could use for the North is complicit, okay? Just a little. When we look at the New England colonies, and Pennsylvania included, they served as the breadbasket for the Caribbean. They fed the enslaved all through that area. In fact, during the Revolutionary War, over 14,000 Africans died in Jamaica from hunger because they could not get food. Everything that the planter needed in order to produce their resources in the South was provided by the North, including luxury items. You know, I always thought they just came from Europe. Some did, but most of them came from the Northeast corridor.
every dollar that a planter made, 40 cents of it was spent in the North.
Wow.
By the mid-1700s, there were on record 41,000 enslaved Africans in the area. And that number is kind of fluid because people were going in, going out. A lot of people weren't registered because of the tariffs, right? 20,000 of those Africans were in New York alone. Yeah. So we had a large number of enslaved people here. The other myth is that somehow, yes, okay, we had slaves in the North, but they were treated better. Slavery is a state of war. Okay, you have a unwilling population. You have internal enemies. There's no such thing as a kind of gratuitous, beneficial type of enslavement. I don't know where that idea has come from. Now, as we come into Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, of course, we'll go to William Penn. Now, when William Penn first arrived in 1681, in his mind, he had the idea that the first Africans could actually be termed indentured servants, okay? The definition of indentured servants does not apply to enslavement. I mean, it's two different things.
Yeah.
But probably, as I thought about it, the first group of Africans that came over actually came from Barbados. So they were seasoned, all right? So they spoke the language, okay, and had mannerisms of the West. So maybe William Penn thought, okay, we can work with these people. Maybe they are. But within 3 years, because of the labor shortage, William Penn changed his mind, all right? So by 1683, the Quakers, another kind of myth within Philadelphia and Pennsylvania that the Quakers, were not involved in slavery. The Quakers purchased 150 Africans. They were the first, and throughout enslavement in Pennsylvania, they were the largest holders of slaves. And this brings in the question of morality, Christianity. After 4 years of enslaving Africans, the Quakers came up with the idea, well, you know what? This is an abomination to God. We can't do this. But it was too late. It was too much money being made. So throughout the 17th, 18th centuries, you had a small group of Quakers who really tried to impress upon their brethren to let go of their property. But it's going to take 100 years before they actually convince them. It's going to be 1758. They're going to say, okay, you can't come to the meeting house anymore if you have enslaved, but it did not work. As we come into Philadelphia, and I'm going to move into the dockets, Philadelphia was a major port to receive Africans. And in fact, Charles Willing, the founder of University of Pennsylvania, was one of the largest sellers of Africans in this area, him along with his friend Robert Morris. Oh. Yes. And so you always had, and also in Philadelphia, it was a shipbuilding port. The ships had to be refitted in order to bring Africans in. All right. They had to put planks in differently so that they could lay them there. That refitting was done here in Philadelphia. All right. So we this area played a major role. And then just back to the Quakers, even though they knew that the institution of enslavement was wrong, they didn't know what to do with black people. Okay, by 1700s, they're going to invite them to the meeting house. They're going to educate some. But basically, they were still harnessed by those same ideas of racism. Yeah. They believed that black people had potential, but they thought they were very lazy. They were idle. They criminals, which lead us to the dockets. So in 1700s, not only are the Quakers the major holders of Africans, they also serve in the legislature. So that they're the ones who created the court, the special court for African people, and thus we have the dockets. And I'm going to pass it on to the judge.
Thank you. I'm on, I believe.
Yes,
Yeah.
you're on.
Let me just add a bit of history. A lot of people think that William Penn landed in Philadelphia. He did not. William Penn landed with an African in Chester. And so what happened was, well, why is there Penn's Landing? That's because Chester sold the name to Philadelphia. So let's just talk about the economics of it, really. But Chester was where he landed, and Chester was where slaves were brought in. It makes sense because that's the first port that they came to coming up the river from the Atlantic. So if you step off of Front Street in Chester and go about maybe 20 blocks, you come to that courthouse where enslaved Africans were tried.
And just watching you all prepare for this discussion, I saw you go back and forth so many times. And when you would bring up one point, it brings up another, right? And I think that is a really good example of how I think sometimes when we're conceptually thinking about slavery, we're thinking about kind of individual people doing these things to other individual people or groups of people, but not understanding just how systemic it was. And so I think in your example saying they maybe wanted to make a change, but conceptually couldn't even think of what that would look like, because at that point, the ideas about Black people, the ideas about kind of the economy were so baked into everything, right? So if we are moving on to the dockets, we know that items like the dockets today are, of course, some of the most impactful reminders of what the institution of slavery really looked like. So Judge Nichols, can you tell us, for someone who would open a docket like we have today, and some people did come up and take a look, what exactly are we reading?
What they're reading is a transcript, so to speak, of what happened. And when you look at that transcript, first thing you see is that there were men who were assigned to hold the trials by the king. And these were men who were clearly men of means. And some of the names, some of the surnames rang a bell with me because I said, wait a minute, Upland, I know where Upland is, and there's a man named Upland in these dockets who served out on the trial. So I think you saw there was wealth, there was status, and that got passed down for centuries. And so when you had the trial, you had people who were obviously the people of power making that decision. There were no lawyers for anyone, and there was no opportunity for anybody who was enslaved to say anything. There would be a presentation, there would be a decision, and then it would be handed down. And depending on what was happening, it could be very draconian. And you think about, well, what did the slave have to say? Nothing was said. They would just say, and now pleads non cult et de hoc, which is a Latin phrase which pretty much means, I am not responsible. I'm not responsible. So when you talk about the issue of justice, there was no opportunity for anybody who was enslaved to say anything. The plea was automatically made, non cult et de hoc, that was it. And then he went on and made the decision.
So we've said before that this document is really a microcosm of slavery, right? Where you are kind of reading the words and getting a more deep understanding for then what is that actually like for the person who had that experience. And so I know you both agree that one of the best angles for this conversation is to really tell the stories of some of the people represented in the dockets that Dr. Williams called to light earlier. So I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Nichols. I know there's a couple you wanted to start with.
Well, there's a lot to choose from.
I know.
I will just choose one, and I think it says a lot. This was the trial of the slave, Dick, who was the slave of a mulatto woman, which I think says a lot there. He was a slave of a mulatto, and you're asking yourself, how did a mulatto woman have the authority to own a slave? Well, if you think about the power that was wielded, they could do anything. And perhaps she looked very white. That's the assumption I would make. But she was in a position of power because somebody else gave that to her. And so he's charged with it. And he was charged with stealing something. And as a result, they said, wait a minute, our decision is going to be we're going to whip him. And you think, well, wait a minute, you didn't want to kill him? They whipped him and then sold him away from the colony. So he was still a commodity that it could be used elsewhere and sold, I assume, down south, where slavery was much more draconian than it is here. And that's just one example of it. And you ask yourself, how did she come to have that kind of power? If you think about it long enough, and you think about the power that white men had over everyone, including white women, it's quite logical that that could happen.
Yeah. And for people unfamiliar with what that word means, can you just give
All
a
right,
brief
so
explanation?
I had to go back to my high school Latin, which was really bad. Non call et de hoc meant I am not responsible. So non call et de hoc, call means responsibility. So basically saying I'm not responsible. You're not allowed to say I'm innocent or I'm guilty, just saying I'm not responsible. So then it's left up to whoever's making the decision to decide what will be that decision.
And I'm glad you explained that too. I mean, the term mulatto too, if someone has not heard that term before.
Mulatto is someone who is the product of the slave master, who is white, and an African woman.
Thank you.
Yeah, we also found interesting that they didn't use the words bastard when they referred to her, but anybody else who was a mulatto, they called them a bastard in there. And what was interesting to me is that the court was made up of 2 justices and 4 freeholders, 6 freeholders, who were apparently slaveholders. Okay, and they're the ones who made the decision. And then the whipping post was right outside of the courtroom. So in every case, punishment was dispensed immediately, and they would get, in most cases, except for Dick, everybody else got 39 lashes.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And then you had to pay the whipper 15 pence.
And I think also it shows a very good example of the institution of slavery or the treatment of enslaved Black people, with having kind of the punishment in some ways immediately outside the courthouse, right? Because we know that in different areas, seeing people be punished was almost a form of entertainment, or it was almost a form of, oh, we're seeing what gets decided, and then people would watch the punishment.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things I found interesting was there were certain cases, and I'd read the case and say, well, I'm pretty sure I know what the decision is going to be, and it would not be what I expected. And the next thing I thought was, who were these men who were making the decision, and what kind of influence did they have on each other? For this individual to be given this justice, quote unquote, and a different individual with the same charges to be given that justice. So I think that was going on, and obviously none of the dockets would show that, but I think if you read enough of them, you begin to say, wait a minute, there's a difference going on here depending on perhaps who those judges are.
Yeah.
And the punishment, not only the 39 lashes, but if it was theft or rape, they would be branded on the forehead, a R for rape, a T for theft, and then put out of the area. So it's like the scarlet letter, so that they had to wear that.
Yeah. And I would imagine too, as they're then taken somewhere else, right? That probably did determine what their treatment looked like as well, right? That you're coming in, you're branded.
I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that you all said too that one of the stories that particularly stood out was Phoebe, the story of the only female who's mentioned in the dockets. And can you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Phoebe was charged with stealing gold buttons from someone's house. And I know I shouldn't have read into the dockets, but I read, well, what is she going to do? Take them down and sell them somewhere? Who was she going to sell these buttons to? So my first thought was, how do you charge this person with stealing something as valuable as that when you think about You steal something of value, you want to get value for it. So where was she going to sell them? So that's the first thing I questioned, was whether or not this was really a charge that was actual. But in any event, that's what she was charged with.
Yeah.
And so as a result of that, punishment was death.
It's interesting, they didn't kill any of the men.
Yeah.
She's the only one that was executed.
That's right. That's right. So we have to ask ourselves about gender equality
Yeah.
or gender inequality there. Absolutely.
Yeah. And how gender also was one of the ways that then people assigned value, right? Because again, we're thinking about what are the use of people as opposed to who they are. Yeah.
Abraham Johnson, I don't know if you want to talk about Abraham. No, go ahead, talk about Abraham. You go.
Oh, you could start.
Well, we were trying to really unpack Abraham because Abraham was charged with killing another slave. All right. They tried him the first time and said he was not guilty.
Yeah. The first time.
And they're
then
also
what
doing some
happens?
verification too, because they've been discussing.
And then what happens, Judge?
He gets tried again. So we think about double jeopardy. Everybody, or the lawyers know about double jeopardy. You can't be charged twice for the same offense. Double jeopardy comes out of our Constitution and our laws. But in this situation, it was about power. And so then you ask yourself, what kind of conversation occurred before the trial? What happened during the trial? And what kind of conversation occurred after that trial for them to say, we're going to try him again. We didn't get the result we wanted. We're going to try him again.
Now, do you think it was uncommon for people to be found not guilty? Just in general.
I do.
Okay.
I do.
And so would you imagine that then in a non-guilty verdict, they may just say, well, let's do it again. It couldn't be that he's not guilty. Let's try this again.
Well, I guess what I imagine too is that it's not like you go into a jury room and you say, all right, nobody get involved. There were discussions. These individuals who were making these decisions were men of power and men of control. And I cannot believe that they would then say, well, we're not going to have the discussion. Well, first, the judicial system hadn't gotten that sophisticated. So I think you'd have the discussion, all right, what are the charges? We'll talk about it. We're going to talk about what we're going to do, not whether or not this individual's innocent. There was the one case where somebody was found innocent, but other than that, that's it. That's it.
Everybody else was guilty.
Yeah.
And so when these men are in such positions of power, obviously the people who they are trying are literally being seen as property, right? Where does that power dynamic come in? Where are the areas where they are essentially executing their power in these conversations? Like, what would you imagine those would look like?
I think the power starts as soon as they get the appointment. You've talked to someone, you're going to be the one who's going to sit in the courtroom, and you've probably made a decision on some other things with people of power in the government. And because of that, you're able to step in and have that kind of decision-making power. And so when you have that kind of power, what they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely, perhaps that's what was going on. But, obviously these dockets don't tell you about that type of corruption, but you can read into it when you see the kind of decisions that are being made, and especially when it's a situation where there's not an opportunity for anybody to plead innocent. It was always non-cult et de hoc. You throw yourself on the mercy of the court.
You had witnesses in each case. And then I think the freeholders were there voluntarily. I don't see any place where they were compensated. So it was just a matter of just getting through it. And the mindset. As soon as you walk in, they already believe this person is guilty. So it was just going on with that. But there was another part of the dockets. The next part, we want to talk about manumission.
And I want to talk about the concept of, so manumission, and just to define the word, is the act of releasing an enslaved person from the custody of their owners. And I want to talk a bit about the concept of freedom and manumission, because we know that it's mentioned in the dockets for 2 individuals. Also, Pennsylvania has been seen as a progressive state at the time for the 1780 Act for the Gradual Emancipation of Slavery, and note the word gradual, which in theory was supposed to free all enslaved people. But even with this being the first law of its kind, in actuality, it kind of didn't really pan out as you would think based on kind of the wording of the law. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about manumission as seen in the dockets, and then how that translates to what we were seeing in that 1780 Act.
So the judge and I were talking about freedom. It's a very fluid concept. What did freedom actually mean at that time? Yes, Pennsylvania did have the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780. It was the first colony that did so. But who did it free? It didn't free anybody. What I failed to mention was once the Quakers sought to regulate Africans, they came up with certain codes, and part of those codes was the concept of manumission. If a master wanted to set their enslaved person free, they had to pay at least 30 pounds to prove that that person will be taken care of, that that person couldn't be idle. And if that person did not work once they were emancipated, they could be bound by any magistrate and re-enslaved. So really, so by 1780, they did come up with an idea of gradual enslavement, and what's interesting, it was really the people in Delaware County, Chester County at that time, who really opposed this, even though it was so mild. Anyone who is born after 1780 will not be a slave if they are registered. You had to register them. And that's what we see in the dockets following the 2 people who are actually manumitted. You see the list of babies. But most people did not register. Again, they would have to pay taxes, and then they would feign ignorance. Oh, I didn't know I had to do that. And the first question that came to my mind was, well, when Black people found out about that, what did they do? And they did. Later on, they would take them to court and get their freedom. But actually, it really didn't free anybody, because what it says is, now here's this indentured servant. You're going to move from being a slave to being an indentured servant, and you're going to have to serve 28 years. Well, the average person only lived to 21. All right. And we talked about Raisin. They finally, in the dockets, they let Raisin free. Well, Raisin was 45 years old. That's like 90 today. We're just going to let him go. But they were very fearful that these people would be idle. Oh, and the other part of the 1780 ordinance was what I call the George Washington rule. If you come into Pennsylvania and you have a slave with you, you cannot keep them in the state over 6 months. So what George Washington, he had 2 slaves who he loved. And of course, they ran away from him. They didn't love him. Hercules and Ona. Hercules was his chef. And so what he would do every 6 months was take them to New York or Maryland or somewhere, keep them overnight, and bring them back into the state to keep them there. So it was all those types of ordinances. And following Pennsylvania, other states fell in line, but Pennsylvania was the most severest. And lastly, it was really propaganda, because everybody around the world at that time knew about the contradiction between slavery and democracy. And so this was a way of saying, oh, yes, we know, but our hearts are in the right place. We're really going to set these people free, as they were demanding their own freedom.
I did run across an interesting docket where someone who lived in Cecil County, Maryland, registered someone who was free here in Pennsylvania. And members of the Bar Association will appreciate that. That person who had this free person registered, who was from Cecil County, Maryland, was Elizabeth Price. Yeah, that name ring a bell? Absolutely. So I say that to say, at least there was at some point in time the realization that if you're free, you're going to be able to travel. If you're free, you're going to be able to make some of your own decisions. And when you have that kind of situation, things will start to change. But it was a very, very, very slow process.
Yeah.
A very slow process. So.
And then by the time we get to 1793, we had the Fugitive Slave Clause. But Pennsylvania had already banned kidnapping in the state in 1726, but nobody paid attention. Didn't really matter. And the judge made me think of a case of Mary, who I poured libations to. Poor Mary. Mary was freed by her master in Maryland. And she decides she already had a few children. She moves to Pennsylvania, marries a free man, and has another baby. Well, her master died. And the family decided they wanted to sell her in order to get the money. So they sent a slave catcher at that time into Pennsylvania, and they captured her and her children, even the one born in Pennsylvania, and they were all sold into slavery. And that became a very important Supreme Court case, your Prigg case. And the Supreme Court basically said the law in Pennsylvania that is against kidnapping is just a frivolous law. We're not paying any attention to that. You know? And no one never knew what happened to Mary. So really, only people who really set free you could be set free in a will, but then the family always had the right to come back and get you. So in the dockets, we do have a family that gave up their right, the heirs. Okay, they said, okay, well, yeah, they were set free, but you're going to stay free. We're not going to come back to you. But then on the other hand, another woman had set her slaves free, and then once she died, her estate went bankrupt. So the creditors went, captured the slaves to sell them. So, what is freedom?
Yeah.
They were always in a very precarious state. They never knew if they were going to get kidnapped, what was going to happen to them at any point.
I always had a question about the few cases where the enslaved person was charged with stealing gold buttons. And so that bothers me. Yes, that bothers me. What was that person going to do? Oh, I'm going to go down to the pawn shop and I'm going to, no. So if those buttons had that type of value, what were they going to do with them? And my thought is, was there some other way that these buttons made into an economy, not an economy controlled by black people, but by other people? And said, you do that, and obviously if you get caught, you're on your own, but if not, there's something that you get, and I don't know what that person would be able to get, but I saw too many of those cases that made me just question, why would a person bother to steal gold buttons? He couldn't wear them, or she couldn't wear them. They had no value to them at that point in time. So it always made me wonder, was there an underground economy here where somebody who was not a slave was saying, I want to take advantage of that. If the slave gets caught, that's their problem. But if they don't, I make money off of it.
Yeah, there was definitely collusion. There's definitely collusion.
Yeah. And I think some of the best points that you make are really kind of this cycle. And when you ask the question, what is freedom? What does freedom look like? I know when revisiting the gold buttons, right, was there maybe a promise of something if she was able to then complete whatever task might have been given to her? But in asking what is freedom, that there, even beyond slavery, that there have been so many cycles of there's a new law, there's a new barrier in place, there's something else that can, even if you are free technically, there's something that can, a loophole, so to speak, that can bring you right back to where you were before, or even in a place that is, hundreds of miles away from where you are. Yeah.
One case that the judge likes, he likes the Fogg case. William Fogg tried to vote in 1835, and according to the Pennsylvania Constitution, it said that free men can vote. All right, but then they said free spacemen can vote, but not free men can vote together, right? And the judge likes this because they told Fogg, perhaps as time goes by, and you assimilate with white people and get some white blood in you, you'd be good enough to vote as we go down the line. So this was the thinking of the time. And as we say, freedom, what did it mean? The law, as the judge pointed out, it was all about privilege and what they decided at any given time. And they could interpret it any way that they wanted to.
Yeah. And the example you just gave, that wasn't found in the
No,
dockets,
those are
correct?
the dockets.
And where's that from?
Oh, the Fogg case.
Yeah.
That's from Clarendon County, right here in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Let me bring this into the 20th century by talking about the late Judge Leon Higginbotham, who was a judge, the second African-American judge to serve on the Third Circuit Court of Appeals. I learned about him when I was a young lawyer doing some research in the Delaware County Law Library, and the librarian in Charlotte Hewlings was there. And there was a display case with these dockets there. I didn't know what they were, and I said, "What are these?" And she said, "Well, those are the dockets of slaves. So how did they get here?" And then she told me about Judge Leon Higginbotham, who'd written a book, or was writing a book, and researching the dockets, and the book was called In the Matter of Color. In the introduction to the book, Judge Higginbotham talks about the fact that he, along with 16 other African-American students, were the first students to integrate a Midwestern university. And it was in 1944. And they were told that you can attend this university, but you have to stay in this dormitory, which was the second floor of basically what was a barn, and it was unheated. And it was the middle of winter in the Midwest. And so you know what that was like. And so he was the one who decided, I'm going to go talk to the president about this. He said, look, and he dressed up, he thought appropriately, and went to the president and said, look, we are here, we're in the first class, and it's cold, can you move us or give us some heat? And the president said, if you don't like it here, you can leave. And I'm sure that was something that always resonated with him.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was something that he thought about when he began to do the work that he did on his dockets and do the work here in Delaware County. I'm just thankful to the Bar Association, Charlotte Hewlings, and the Court of Common Pleas to recognize the value of those dockets for all of these years. Because a lot of other people would have said, they don't have any value.
Right.
And they sat there for a number of years until, obviously, we got to this point. And I'm very pleased and proud to be a member of the Bar Association that made sure that happened.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we have, I'm taking a look at some of the questions that we have coming in. So one person asked, the slave docket that we have here contains about a dozen registrations of Black children between 1792 and 1809 in accordance with Pennsylvania's gradual abolition legislation. Have more of these documents survived? There is a 7-year gap in the entries, leading me to believe that the slave docket only records a handful of these registrations.
Oh yeah, they said themselves. Because the Quakers played with the tariffs. First, they tried to put a high tariff in the beginning, and the Crown, while they were still under British rule, and the Crown negated that. They did not want the colonists to play a role and interrupt the trade, not even trade, the kidnapping, brutality of exploitation of Black bodies. They didn't want them to interfere with that. So the tariffs went up and down. So no, they just didn't register them. Because you think, okay, 1790, that was the first official census taken by the US government. And here in Pennsylvania, there was 3,700 slaves. Okay, so those are the ones they counted. So we know it was probably double that, right? They weren't going to, and we look at the dockets and it's only a handful. It's obvious that they did not record their property.
And we do know of other physical dockets that do exist. It just so happens that the Bar Association in particular had this one that we have, but we know there were probably innumerable.
The Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And also, this is a plug for the Charles Blockson Collection at Temple University. They just acquired some chains and some actual chains and other original dockets. They even have a book where the cover of the book, I don't even know why I'm going here, was made from the skin of a Black man.
Oh my God.
After he was burned alive, they would skin them and make wallets, belts, and books, and the Blockson collection has that. So yes, right here in Philadelphia, we have major resources of from slavery that we can actually handle today.
Chester County also has some documents and maybe dockets, because people think of, well, there was a separation. There was Chester and Chester County, and then there was Delaware County. And a lot of the dockets that were Chester County are now Chester City, or Chester County then are now in the other Chester County. So there may be more up there. And one of the things we want to be able to do is to work with the Chester County Historical Society to take a look at some of those dockets, obviously. Not that we want to take them from them. We think there are more dockets that we could get access to, would give us more information.
Yeah. And thank you. You also kind of cleared up a little bit of history of the counties and the change in name. So a few other questions I think we'll be able to get to. Were mulatto men in position of power also able to serve and make decisions about slaves?
No. Every time they talk about a mulatto man, they refer to him as a bastard and try to get rid of him.
Right.
Yeah.
Another question that is specifically about kind of the process of the trials and then different punishments that were administered. If 39 lashes were administered, how did the person or persons survive? If he or she survived, would they not have been severely hurt? And could they not have been, as then they put in quotes, valuable?
I think that's possible. I mean, I don't know, obviously, what the physiological effect of it would be, but it can't be good. And I guess the question is, if you're going to give them 39 lashes with the understanding that this is quote unquote valuable property, and that property is then not going to be valuable to you, what do you do? What do you do with that property? Do you say, well, we'll sell it down south? And the South was, no, we don't want. So that's an interesting question. And perhaps that's something that, while the system said, this is how we'll treat them, the system wasn't ready to deal with, well, what are you going to do with the consequences of this brutality?
Yeah.
How are you going to handle that? Is that going to be recorded? Of course not.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were very short-sighted. And this is where we get the problem with the suffrage, abolition, and revolts. They're all tied together here,
Yeah.
you see. And the fear, the greatest amount of fear they had of Black people at the time drove a lot of the legislation and the regulations, but they didn't think far ahead as to, and plus there were so many Africans coming in. Constantly, so, and you wanted somebody to be an example to the others.
Yeah.
So we can, and the master was compensated. If a slave was executed for a crime, the master received compensation, received reparations. Oh, this was one thing I want to point, I have to go out of the country. When in 1833, when the Brits ended slavery, right, they made the slaves serve a period, again, indentured or apprenticeship for 20 years in order to pay off the reparations. The Brits have just finished paying off the money they paid the slave owners in 2015.
Did they pay interest on that money?
2015, yeah.
Did they pay interest on that money?
They just, so we all, if you have a bank account, we all help pay for our own reparations. And it was the same thing with the 1780 Act.
Yeah.
If you kept them indentured for 20 years, then they paid off their own fee. So one author called it philanthropy by the bargain, because they lost nothing. And only saw one case of a master who killed a slave. They said that he should be executed, but there's no record of him being executed. They just asked him, would you kindly leave?
Let me go to another question. We've got a couple questions popping up on my screen right now. That's why I'm kind of looking at all of them. So, were conversations about the ethics of slavery being had while the founding fathers were trying to establish the Constitution? If so, what arguments were made for and against?
No.
No.
That's an easy answer. No, they didn't care about that.
So no.
This is and this is what makes Pennsylvania so interesting, but because we have the Quakers, you know, so we have this whole morality question, but there was no real distinction or attention paid to Christianity. The first slave ship was named the good ship Jesus. So no, it was all about money, and in Pennsylvania they did in 1712 pass an ordinance that limited the number of Africans coming into Pennsylvania. Of course, no one paid any attention to that. But what I found interesting that was the same year where you had a revolt in New York. You know, so that fear that was coming in, so it wasn't a moral question. It was about protecting themselves.
And I think you gave a great example of that when you all were answering the questions about the 39 lashes, right? You said they had very little foresight into what this was going to do to the person. They just administered punishment with very little thought, again, as to this person as a human being and more as punishment towards property, right? So I want to, as we start to wrap up, I want to answer or ask one final question from our audience and then have our wrap-up question. So how do we reconcile historical realities and avoid moral judgments based on the perspective of viewing matters through a modern lens? Should I ask again?
Yeah, ask that again.
So how do we reconcile historical realities and avoid moral judgments based on the perspective of viewing matters through a modern lens? So I think what the person is asking is if we're thinking about where we are today, and then we are looking at history, how are we thinking about this morally?
Well, I'm going to play with that a little bit. Modern lens. Those of you who have gone to the eye doctor and gotten glasses, and they put this little thing on to see, try this lens, how's that? Try this lens, how's that? They're trying different lenses to see which one works the best. And so when we talk about a modern lens, there's not just one modern lens, and that lens is changing all the time. Absolutely. All the time. So when people say modern lens, you got to give me a little bit more information. And is that modern lens the kind of lens that I would like, or that this professor would like, or that you would like, or that some of the members of the bar would like? I don't know. But I think what you have to do is we have to keep looking at that lens. Yeah. We have to.
Yeah. The way it hit me was, can you be more objective about this? No, I cannot. No. It was wrong. I don't know what morality that you would talk about. Even today, people believe that Black people are less than human, that they don't feel the same pain that other people. And it's going to be a Quaker in 1830 that's going to lead the studies of proving the inferiority of Blacks by measuring the skulls. And of course, we know University of Penn is going to take off on that. They really need to pose themselves to provide reparations. The more I think about University of Penn, the more upset I get. No, I'm trying not to be passionate, angry about it, but I think, especially now with this attack on critical race theory, that somehow or another we are supposed to look at history and say, okay, this is what happened. They were well-meaning people. Look at our founding fathers. They did the best they could with what they had. And okay, there was a little collateral damage. All these people were killed, maimed, separated from their families, tortured. But, that was history. Let's move on from there. And no, we cannot just move on from there. We have to reconcile what happened. Yeah. Okay? We have to address these. And I love the remarks Congresswoman Scanlon made because, here's my plug, the reparations bill, and she's a signatory on it, I hope, and is in Congress. We need to come to grips with slavery and what happened and provide reparations so that we can talk about equity and justice as we move on. And that is not being objective. That was my opinion. I'm sorry, person who asked that question.
No, and I think, right, when we have questions like these, to a certain degree, when we don't have someone asking us directly, you know, we're translating it to a certain point, but I find it interesting that you both answered in slightly different ways. I also think that when we're thinking about history, any history, but if we're particularly looking at slavery in the US, you could go to any date, pick any date, and you can say, okay, well, how did changes then in the next 10 years, how was that reflected in what was decided here? And then how was that reflected in the next 50 years? Where we see these cycles that you mentioned before, right, where individuals are maybe set free, and then years later, someone says, oh, well, we've decided you're enslaved again. But we see this throughout history, where it's not just individuals, but entire groups who, oh, we're taking a few steps ahead, but then a law, an act, actual individuals who seek to destroy us, you know, then bring us back. And we can look at that throughout history.
But
We
see,
can
that's
take a
the
thread.
problem with Africans and African descendants, is that the history has come into the present. It has not really changed. You know, judge your courtroom before you retired. What did it look like? You know, who were the people there? You know, when I first heard 1700, we're setting up a special court for Negroes, I laughed. I'm like, we still have special courts for Negroes. You know, you go down to the justice, what do you see? So that is a problem. Those ideas that were held back then about Black people are still plaguing us today. And until we get beyond that, we're not going to see much of a change.
Let me give you two viewpoints. With the members of my fraternity, we did a Black History program for the children at the Boys and Girls Club in Chester. And the former superintendent of Chester Upland School District was giving a little lecture. And he talked about the fact there was a school in Chester at one point called Phyllis Wheatley Elementary. And none of the students knew who Phyllis Wheatley was. Didn't know that she came over here as a child, enslaved, and became one of the greatest writers in the history of this country. And so I think part of it is that as individuals, we all have to kind of take on it ourselves and say, wait a minute, I'm going to be the agent of change. I'm going to do something different. Through Widener, thankfully, I had the opportunity to go to Kenya twice and be in their international summer program. And so I'm there and I'm meeting some of the brothers and sisters from Africa. And a guy came up to me and said, I'm very proud of you. Why? His point was he viewed me as having some privilege, as if I had suffered slavery, and he was proud that and I'm thinking, no, that was my great-great-great-grandfather. But his point was that he had pride in me simply because of the color of my skin. And that's what I think we have to try to get our folks to begin to have, and then we can begin to stand up and say, no, wait a minute. No, it's going to be different. It's going to be different. Is it going to be easy? Is it going to be tomorrow? Absolutely not. But what we're doing here today is a big start for it.
It is.
Absolutely. And as we only have a few minutes left, I'm going to probably ask you both to do what might be the most difficult thing tonight. And I know when we have conversations, people always say, well, what should I do next? What should I do right now? What's maybe the one thing I should read? And so I'm going to ask you both what you would think the one thing people should or could do next, if they're thinking about learning more, if they're thinking about moving towards equity. But I'm going to ask you to do it in about a minute.
It's going to take me a minute to come up with an answer. How do you do that? Well, as the judge was just pointing out,
Can you use the mic?
Is taking pride in ourselves. And one thing that we didn't get to that I want to pull in are the revolts.
Yeah.
Okay, many Black people believe that we are inferior, that we were subordinate, we were very subservient to the masters during slavery. And there were numerous revolts. And just that short period during the dockets, I was just looking at that, just from 1762 to 1830, there were over 150 revolts throughout America and the Caribbean. You know, we only talk about Nat Turner and whatever, and right here in Pennsylvania, right here in York, and they talk about how the slaves was treated so well in Pennsylvania. Well, why were they running away and poisoning their masters all the time and having revolts? Okay, and right here in Pennsylvania, York, Christiana, we had revolts. So I think we need to look at our history different. We need to tell the truth. It's not so much of the pointing out just one or two people who made it.
Yeah.
But looking at the whole gamut, looking at who we really are as a people, looking at our strength and what we contributed to this country. This country would not be the country it is today if it had not been for people in those dockets doing the work to build this country. And they need to be acknowledged, and we need to be proud of that and not ashamed of being enslaved. Because look at where, just like he said now, look at where you are now. You know, and it wasn't your great 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 grandfather, it was just your great great. we're only 4 generations out of slavery. You know, this is not ancient history here. Right? And people need to realize that. So I think it begins with a mindset. We need to see ourselves differently, talk about ourselves differently, think about ourselves differently, seeing ourselves as creatures of God.
Yeah.
You know, and then we can move on.
Judge.
I find that when there's something that's important and relevant that should resonate inside, the shorter, the better. So I'm going to tell you what I hear, and where I heard it is not important. But it's what people say, it's kind of an echo. Each one, the response is, each one, reach one. Each one, teach one. That's it. Each one, reach one. Each one, teach one.
And I think I can speak for a lot of people and say that between you both, tonight it was not just reach one, teach one, it was a much larger audience. And I thank you both for this conversation.
Thank you for having us.
And so we unpacked a lot this evening, and I want to end us with a quote that I feel sums up our conversation. Across the United States and abroad, there are places whose histories are inextricably tied to the story of human bondage. Many of these places directly confront and reflect on their relationship to that history. Many of these places do not. But in order for our country to collectively move forward, it is not enough to have a patchwork of places that are honest about this history while being surrounded by other spaces that undermine it. It must be a collective endeavor to learn and confront the story of slavery and how it has shaped the world we live in today. And that is a quote from Clint Smith from his book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Again, I thank you all for joining us tonight. Every time we come together to have discussions like this, collectively we become more informed and more able to imagine equitable change. So thank you all again. Have a great evening.